Ukraine. This is the newspapers and their sort of take on what's been happening. Now, obviously, things are moving pretty quickly, but this is sort of like a recap of what the main UK papers are putting out about what's going on in Ukraine at the present time. This one's the Torygraph, and it's saying that Putin is warning of bloodshed as he moves troops into Ukraine. The premise is Putin had a conference yesterday and he recognised the two areas on the eastern side of what was Ukraine, which is now these two independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. This has been going on for years and years and years, since around 2014. There was a meeting in Minsk with Ukraine, Russia, the Normandy pair, which is France and Germany. They were tasked with trying to sort out this breakaway regions and the fighting that was going on. They've had various meetings. None of these outcomes of any of these meetings have been satisfactory to stop the conflict. The conflict has rolled on and rolled on and rolled on. 14,000 seems to be a number which is quoted in lots of the papers as the number of people that have died primarily because of this conflict. That's about 2,000 or so people a year, 40 people a week, 6 or 7 people a day, every day, continuously for 6 or 7 years. Now, Russia and Putin regard the people in that area as being basically Russian. A lot of them have dual citizenship, and Putin, I would imagine, has got a wee bit tired after all of these meetings with France and Germany in Ukraine for nothing to be resolved and the fighting to be continuing going on. This comes down to self-determination. Countries throughout time, countries from the beginning of time have broken up as people within them have decided that they don't want to be part of the original country. Amazingly hypocritical of the Americans to be complaining about other countries breaking up, because America was formed basically by a revolution, by breaking away from an original country. But now, a couple of 100 years later, you can't do that. These borders are sacrosanct, they can't move. You win this, you win that, and all of the rest of the stuff. Lots of other countries have broken and split up. Ireland in the 1920s, the Civil War, the Irish Independence War, Home Rule, forming the Irish Free State, and then going on to form Ireland as a separate country. The borders in Ireland have changed. At one time, the whole of Ireland. Now there's a border separating parts of Ireland. Whether that border stays in the future, who knows? It's up to the people in those places to decide that. And if they agree, and if they have like a referendum or they have a vote on it, then surely the borders can change. Same thing's going to happen with Scotland in the UK. At some point, I've got no doubt that there will be a majority of people in Scotland vote for independence. That's great. That's up to the people in Scotland. There'll be a few bridges to cross, how to sort out the deficits and who owes people what and all of the rest of the stuff. But those things, I don't think, really come into play with what's happening in these breakaway republics. So Putin said that Ukraine is like a government of genocide. He said that the West, with NATO, is holding a knife to the throat of Russia, basically considering and allowing this eastern expansion of NATO all of the way up to the borders with Russia if Ukraine joins NATO. Ukraine joining NATO, that's up to the Ukrainian people. You've got to wonder if by doing so that you're going to create a huge conflict with your neighbour. Sometimes you can get the same result by slightly different methods. You can have like an associate agreement with NATO, not put any foreign troops or missiles within your borders. There's ways around this. But Britain and Mrs. Truss is basically been rattling the tin, rattling the sabre, saying, no, it's up to Ukraine and basically stuff what Russia wants. It's a juvenile way to look at things that's sort of totally black and white. attitude towards it. It smacks of not caring about what the other party wants in the discussions. Anyway, Putin signed some sort of decree, recognized the independence of the Russian-speaking separatist regions. On this basis, when is an invasion not an invasion? Well, an invasion is not an invasion. The countries that you put your troops into request assistance. If you considered that area part of Ukraine and Russian troops went into it, then that would be an invasion. But if they're these new little mini countries, and these little mini countries ask for assistance from Russia, and Russia sends troops in, then on that basis, in Russian law, and I would imagine they would say, well, it's not an invasion, but being requested by the government of these new republics for assistance. Obviously, this will be refuted by the United Nations and the United States and the United Kingdom and the EU and Uncle Tom Cobley and just about lots of people. But some countries won't. Some countries will stand with Russia and say, no, self-determination. Not every country in Europe is in NATO. Ireland isn't in NATO. Ireland doesn't believe in NATO, and it's not in it. So you could say, well, what have they got to be frightened of? Who's going to invade Ireland? Well, that's not the point. The point is the Irish have took a stand, interventions in putting their troops in foreign countries. And their stance is they don't want to be part of NATO. They don't want to have troops being put into foreign countries. I would imagine there'll be other countries in the world, Russian countries, places like maybe Syria, Egypt, some of these countries, then obviously perhaps China, who has its own territorial queries, Taiwan. All of the countries, no doubt, will be in the UN saying, yeah, we want a peaceful settlement to it. But this peaceful settlement has been dragging on for 7 or 8 years and nothing's happened. And basically everybody in the world's looked the other way and just let them get on with it. So President Putin said, no, we're not having any of this. This has gone on long enough. These two little republics have suffered enough. Then it's time for this to be resolved. We have to send parts of the Russian military in to assist these people. Then we will. So hopefully it'll settle itself down and people will realise that this is a realistic way to progress. I'm not too sure how the Western countries will do that though, especially the UK. For whatever reasons, and you can go through them, you can go through that it's made a big statement. Prime Minister Johnson has been adamant, he's been vociferous in this, all the normal mumbo jumbo, it's really bad. We're going to do sanctions on you and blah, 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 and we're going to give weapons to the Ukrainians and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them. I think Mrs. Truss, the Foreign Secretary, was saying that, you know, the normal platitudes, we'd stand shoulder to shoulder with you, blah, 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 blah. You've got to look at the motives behind this for British politicians. Some people might say that Prime Minister Johnson has got so much bad things in his intrigue that he's just unable to deal with them, that he isn't a detailed person, that he's a flamboyant person. He's being investigated by the Metropolitan Police for breaking his own lockdown rules, and he's wanting to change the focus and reframe people's image of him in world statesman category, i.e., look at me standing up to the Ruskies. You've also got to look at it down the binoculars of how the US-UK relationship runs. And primarily, it seems to run, the US says something and the UK goes out and does it. When the US doesn't want to do stuff, its own dirty work, its own rebel rousing, it gets the UK Prime Minister. And the classic example of that was Prime Minister Blair running around the world, bigging up having a war and invading Iraq, and bigging up having a war and invading Afghanistan. All the backwards and forwards and the bending in diplomatic language and crossing I's and dotting T's and all the rest of it, trying to get UN agreements and all of the rest to have a war. And Tony Blair, Prime Minister Blair, he ran around. He was basically the lackey, President Bush, when they were doing that. And to my mind, this is just the same thing again. Prime Minister is just the lapdog, President Biden, President Joseph Biden. He's just cracked the whip, and his little lapdog Boris is running around yapping and yapping and being Mr. Big Man, politician, and we'll save Ukraine and all the rest of the stuff. I've got no idea what the people in the UK think about this, but certainly the papers are all pro-Ukraine and sort of anti. Whether the actual people in the country feel that way, I don't know. But certainly I would think a lot of the people in the country don't want any UK troops involved in any external wars which don't directly resolve around the defence of the UK. We've lost too many lads and lasses. We've lost too many people over the years in fruitless, costly wars that have achieved zero for the UK. We've spent billions of pounds in Iraq, billions of pounds in Afghanistan, billions and billions. That money could have been well served by use in the UK, but it hasn't been. It's been spent on these expeditions overseas to achieve what? Who knows? In Iraq, it was to find the weapons of mass destruction, and they haven't been found because they were never there. That was the excuse. That was the excuse to get way in. And who knows what the excuse was to get way into Afghanistan. It's all lost in the elements of the past. But people don't forget the number of servicemen that's come back, some of them wounded, some of them have lost their lives out there, or something which has got very, very little, if anything, to do with the UK. Complete and utter fiasco, waste of time. But there's money involved in this. There's money involved in it. Money for armaments, money for the contracts, money for the backhanders, money for the bribes, money for politicians in some way or another, especially in the United States. There's money in this. There's money in wars. Doesn't make any difference where the wars are. There's money in it. Follow the money. Look at these people that are instigating the wars. Find the money trail, and you'll find the people that's starting and trying to instigate wars for various reasons, made-up reasons. To my mind, it's the same with this. So Putin has been putting his forces to maintain peace in the Donbass region. So he's saying it's been a tragedy there, and his intention is to put Russian troops in to stop the conflict. He mentions nothing about invading other areas. This is peacekeeping agreed between 3 countries, the 2 new little mini countries in Russia. He was on the TV. I watched parts of it. I thought he came across as measured, personally. I thought he came across quite well. He didn't seem as though he was using evocative, fired up language, but he obviously came across as concerned, and he came across as someone that was in control. However, some of the reports in the papers seem to say he was angry and losing his mind and stuff like this. You're always going to get that. It's 2 sides of an argument. If you want to go on, it's on YouTube. You can make your own mind up. You can watch it in 2 versions. I think one where we speak in Russian with subtitles, and I think there's one where there's a translator. The translator has difficulty keeping up with him sometimes, because some of his arguments, some of his points that he's bringing across are reasonably structured, but sometimes it's difficult for the interpreter to keep up with them. And then the paper is saying that the Russian president's tone and description of Ukraine as an imminent security threat that left little hope that war could be avoided. But I don't think there's going to be a war. That's my top and bottom of it. I think that the sum total of it will be the Russian troops going into these new little mini countries, establishing some sort of new border. Now, whether that border is the border that's currently there, where the Ukrainians in these little mini countries are of a sort of front line, or whether that's going to get moved a little bit I don't know. But you would expect that it would move to some sort of structured line which was easy to mark out and people could both agree to it. Hopefully the Ukrainians will agree and we won't get this protracted, drawn out. What seems to be happening though is that the US, Canada, UK, European Union all seem to be lining up saying that they're going to install sanctions on like a sort of increase in scale. You've went in to help these two little mini countries, okay, we'll give you this amount of sanctions. But if you go into other parts of Ukraine where there isn't mainly ethnic Russians, then we're going to increase the sanctions. Boris is talking, that's Prime Minister Johnson, he's talking about sanctions and that they're going to be robust and it's going to be loads of sanctions on, on Russian companies and Russian individuals and this, that and the other. I think you'll find that a lot of this is just hot air. I think when push comes to shove, the banks and the people that finance the Conservative Party, they'll be having a few words with the Conservative people and telling them to stop mouthing off and stop putting sanctions on Russians and Russian businesses. Because I think the City of London, lots of people in London make a lot of money out of what's going on in Russia. Some of these other countries, obviously in the EU, different countries rely on Russia for gas supplies far more than others. Some of the countries have very little to do, say Portugal. There's virtually no effect, I would imagine, on Portugal. So I can't see Portugal being that bothered what sanctions are or not. Some of the other countries will be more vocal, they'll want to stand up and the politicians want to big themselves up. Look at what we are doing. Look at how we are being so severe with sanctions against Russia. I don't think any of the sanctions will work in real terms. Over the last few years, Russia has sort of insulated itself to a degree against sanctions. It's been buying gold over the last few years. It's also been running down its US dollar denominated reserves. It's basically been purging the US dollar out of the Russian system. America exerts a huge amount of political and economic power because, to all extents and purposes, the US dollar is the world reserve currency. It's used primarily in buying commodities throughout the world, primarily oil and gas. The Americans did a deal with the Saudis back in the 40s, and that was Saudi would always price its oil exports in US dollars. In America would support and give military assistance to Saudi Arabia. Where Saudi Arabia's went, the rest of the Arab countries have went, and the rest of the world has went, pricing, and even British companies, Shell and BP, oil companies in essence, their shares are denominated in US dollars. Their dividends are denominated in US dollars because the bulk of that trade is done in US dollars. No matter where they are in the world, they're trading the oil in US dollars. America doesn't like this because it sees Russia exporting lots of gas to Germany. The possibility the Germans and the Russians decide that the Russians will accept German euros instead of US dollars, which will cut the US dollar out of trade. The US has been about stopping Nord Stream 2 since day one. It's imposed restrictions, it's used force and strong arm tactics to stop its own companies helping and supporting building it. It's applied pressure to foreign companies that build these things into foreign companies like the North Veritas, which insures them. Consequently, Nord Stream 2, the Americans don't want, and it's not being used. I think the Russians have come to the conclusion that it's down to the Germans. If the Germans want to get Nord Stream 2 up and running, the Germans are going to have to do some heavy lifting and start pushing back against the Americans. I think the Russians have looked at it and said, there's nothing more we can do to get Nord Stream 2. Our prime concern now is what's happening in Donetsk region. So Putin's went in, and now we've got all of these little lapdogs running around snapping, Prime Minister Johnson, and we've got Foreign Secretary Truss snapping in, making big statements and stuff like that. You need to take a big look and see what the sanctions are. You'll probably find that a lot of these sanctions are next to nothing. Any of the ones that do affect big companies in the UK, I think, will be shortly changed, because the people that pay for the Conservatives ain't going to stand for losing any money by sanctions. That's my view of it. In the United States, it's slightly different. Russia is always paraded as the pariah. They use the Russia to get more money, to get more military contract, to get bigger budget allocations. It's a huge game. The military in America, it's a huge, huge game. But to have a huge military, you've got to have somebody on the other side. You have got to have a bogeyman. And Russia is being paraded as the bogeyman. This just serves as an updated. So the Americans they'll in Congress, they'll put sanctions on them. They'll do this, they'll do that. They'll give the military even more money. And you've got the rebel rousers in America loving this. Then you've got the people in Congress that have got military bases or military contractors in their constituents loving this. It's all free candy. It's all free candy, More money, more aeroplanes, more ships, more everything. President Joseph Biden's is in the same sort of shtick as what Prime Minister Johnson is. He's got inflation through the roof. He's got high gas prices. He's got a lot of people unemployed. He's got bad economics. Makes him look to be a big man if he can step on the world stage and try and duff it out with President Putin. So the Ukraine's off to the UN. They'll all sit down and they'll all mouth platitudes and do motions and not motions, and they'll all have a really nice lunch and talk about it and stand up. And basically, it's just a bunch of hot air. It'll just all run through as ever. Very little, if anything, will get done. If the UN was going to be effective, the UN would have been effective in sorting out world hunger, world poverty, world this. We still live in a world with absolute massive differences in people's levels of well-being, what they can and cannot expect in their lives. Perhaps the UN's helped, perhaps it hasn't. In most cases, it's just a token shop. It's a token shop for people from the elites in each country to get themselves off to New York, have a good time, turn up at the UN a couple of times a week, and the rest of the time kick back in and basically just do whatever you want on the taxpayers' expense. Very little gets done in the UN. Anything contentious comes up against the permanent members, and Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, so there will be no resolutions passed by the Security Council because Russia will veto them. So there's nothing going to happen on that. Certainly not going to be UN troops waltzing through there. That's another reason why the United States funds NATO. It means it gives it another avenue, have troops do its bidding without recourse to the United Nations and international law. So they're all having chinwags together. The US President, UK Prime Minister, and President of France and the Chancellor of Germany, they're all going to have a bit of a get together on the Skype or the Zoom, and they'll all be trying to outbid themselves with what they're going to do in sanctions. You'll find the Germans will not have very many bids in. The Germans will keep stum on this, and they'll let the crazy Brits and maybe it's the crazy French go ahead, hurt themselves by putting sanctions on. I don't think you're going to find the Germans putting any real sanctions on. The volume of gas that they get from Russia is so immense. I think they're wary, but I don't think they need to be, because I don't think there's any intention from Russia to choke back or throttle supplies if the gas. If the Russians have got a contract, they'll stick with it and they'll supply all of the gas that's in the contract. The Russians want to sell the Germans more. I just cannot see the Russians cutting off gas supplies to the EU. It would be short-sighted. It would have a devastating on Europe. It would turn a lot of people in Europe against Russia. And I don't think the Russians would do that. I just don't see it. The other papers, the big broadsheets, are talking about that. They're saying that there's already Russian troops and tanks in the eastern regions in these two little mini countries now, and that's in this Donetsk and Luhansk. Today, Prime Minister Johnson, around about midday time, he's going to stand up. He's going to tell you which toes he's going to cut off and which blunderbuss he's going to put up against his foot to do sanctions against Russia. Like I say, again, betting about them, ruble, euro, or dollar, that it'll be stuff which it'll be very, very little effect on Conservative Party donors. And Mrs. Truss, the Foreign Secretary, she's saying it's going to be directed at individuals and companies with assets in the UK. If that's the case, then these people will just move the assets somewhere else. There's lots of offshore havens that will be easy going and accept Russian money. Mind you, even the Swiss might have accepted it, with Credit Suisse, wherever, 80 billion flopping around from dubious places. So there's always somewhere. So these will just be headline things, you know, Mr. XYZ, you know, we're targeting him, that's a sanction, blah, blah, blah. If Prime Minister Johnson had any sense, he would have kept his head down on this and said next to nothing. But he hasn't. He's wanting to be Mr. Big Man. And I think a lot of that is President Joseph Biden telling him to get out there and rattle the tin, rattle the sabres. If you want to keep in good with us Yankees, get yourself out there, make a fool of yourself, say some stuff. Mrs. Truss, she's saying that by Russia recognising the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, apologies if I'm pronouncing any of this stuff wrong, but that's what it looks like to me, demonstrates Russia's decision to choose a path of confrontation over dialogue. Well, they've been dialoguing for 7 or 8 years and nothing's happened. So I think they've just said, enough dialogue, let's take another path. It's an interesting TV sort of speech by President Putin. If you're not into politics and stuff like that, then it will just be boring. But at least he's had the honesty to go on and give people a full and comprehensive bunch of reasons why he's took the actions which he has. I would think that there's very few other Western leaders, possibly President Macron of France might be in that same sort of league. But I don't think the leaders of the UK or the US would be able to a speech of that length and that complexity together. I just don't think so. The Americans, you've got to have a sound bite, which is less than a couple of seconds, and it's the same in the UK. Whether that's because the populations just won't accept detailed arguments, or they're unable to comprehend them, or people are just not bothered or interested in politics, I don't know. And obviously the politicians reflect the populace. And I don't think it's just this current US president. I can't think of many US presidents that would be able to put together a speech of that complexity and length that Putin. That's on both sides of the political spectrum. Everybody's condemning it, all the international people, blah, blah, blah. Well, they'll all condemn it, and then basically they do nothing. That's, if you've got any sense economically, that's what you do. Make a little statement and say, yeah, it's really terrible, maybe it shouldn't have happened, and then you just go about your business and you do your trade with Russia and you sell stuff to Russia and things just roll on. If you're crazy, you know, you start banging the drum and saying that you're going to, you know, do sanctions and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the European Union, because there's a lot of disparaging views in the EU. They like to present themselves as unified and speaking with one voice. I don't think they'll get acceptance of heavy-handed sanctions pushed through. They might get a few little specific tailored sanctions. Just cannot see them going big. It's the Germans that have the big say. They're the ones that's got most to lose. We'll put sanctions on. We'll not sell you any Beamers or Mercs. The Russians will just say near probs. We'll just buy some Telsas from our pals, the Chinese. We'll just buy some cars from Korea or Japan. You think that's going to stop, will it? Oh, yeah, man. Oh, well, you'll not be able to finance yourself on our markets in London. Okay, we'll get the money somewhere else. Don't worry about it. I think it's a bad stance for us to take. I think we should be looking at it far more realistically of self-determination. If these two little mini countries, if that's what it's come to, then yeah, let's move on with this. Britain traditionally has been on the wrong side of virtually every border change. Didn't like the border change in the 1700s with the Americans, didn't like the border change in Ireland, didn't want to give up India. When it did give up India, it had to partition India. India split up into India and Pakistan. Pakistan subsequently split up to Pakistan and East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. Borders have changed. Britain changed the borders of Nigeria when it did a deal with the French years and years ago. Borders in the Middle East were drawn by the British and the French, just with a straight edge. Lines across the map. This is your influence. This is ours. You get Syria, we take Iraq. The lines change. Look at the borders of Israel. There's conjecture on that. It depends which side you stand on. But traditionally, Britain has been on the wrong side of the argument on virtually every border dispute throughout history. As time passes by, they accept it everywhere. Britain tends to be on the wrong side of the argument in all of these things. And I think through time, you'll find that Britain is on the wrong side of the argument with these two new little mini countries. Time will show that. Let's hope there's no loss of life in these. On either side, on the Ukrainian side, on these two little mini countries side, on the Russian side, or anybody in NATO side, they don't want anybody killed. We want self-determination. We want to let people do and vote and have their own countries if they want. Just like them people in Barcelona, if they want to be different and have their own little country, Barcelona country instead of being in Spain country, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they do that? Why shouldn't the Scottish have their own country or the Scots have their own country? Why not? If that's what the bulk of the Scottish people want. I haven't got any problem with it. I haven't got any problem with anybody throughout the world, anywhere, deciding that they want to form their own countries, as long as it's done peacefully. Apparently, one of the things that President Joseph Biden had offered President Putin was a moratorium on Ukraine's NATO membership. Basically, I translate that into normal people speak, kick the can down the road. We can't sort it out. We don't want to sort it out. We can't come up with a good solution at the moment, so we'll just kick it down the road. We'll say it's a moratorium, or we'll not let them join NATO for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. By that time, I'll be out of power. It'll be somebody else's problem. Western politicians do this all of the time. Virtually every politician in the West does the same thing. They will not address the issues head on. They constantly push them, kick them down the road. It's not just in the UK, US is the same, EU is the same. All of the Western countries are identical. None of the politicians want to grab the problem and sort it out. It's too tricky, it's too hard. They want to do deals, they want to get backhanders, they want to get people that they know contracts, they want to make money, they want to get re-elected. What they don't want to do is do the hard graft that they were elected to do. They don't want to do the stuff that the people that elected them into the parliaments, in congresses, want them to do. That's my view of politicians. It's pretty low. So the breaking update is that, as everybody knew, the Americans have got their way, and the Germans have come out and they've said Nord Stream 2 can't go ahead. There you go. Something that we knew was at the bottom of all this has now happened. So the certification of the Nord Stream 2 can't go ahead given Russia's latest actions, Chancellor Scholz. So he's obviously been taken into a dark corner of the bike sheds by President Joseph Biden, and he's been given a good roughing and duffing up. And he's been told to smarten up and get with the program and get this pipeline closed down. And we'll be sending you some high-priced US fracked gas across shortly. So get your wallet out. And we've got the other people, the Ukrainian president, he's saying that the Russians are buddies. So, and Ukraine's considering breaking off diplomatic relations with Russia. I'm not too sure what that solves. At some point, you're living next door to people. They've still got a border with Russia in certain parts. You've got to keep talking with people. So this is achieved what the Americans. So the Americans will be cock-a-hoop. They've stopped Nord Stream 2, which to my view, that's the whole top and bottom of it. So the Americans, the Yankees, they'll go, we're happy tonight. They've shut it down. What I think will happen is that Nord Stream 2 will go below the radar, and once this gets resolved in like 6 months' time or whatever it is, and people accept that these two little mini states are there, and next winter, and Germany's going to need to heat more gas, and the rest of Europe's going to need to heat more gas, and Nord Stream 2 will quietly get brought back and brought onto line. That's what I think about it. It's just all saber rattling, big guys talk, you know. My brother will beat your brother up. So, a UK minister, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says Russia's broken international law. Yeah, loads of countries break international law. So what? What you can do about it? There's a meeting of the UK-led Expeditionary Force. Where have I heard these names before? The British Expeditionary Force. That went into France. Look what happened there. This was in WW2. It's made up of the defence ministers from the Baltic states and the Nordic countries. And he's saying that President Putin's recognition of the two rebel-held regions, he's not calling them mini countries, it's a worrying sign. So obviously they've got satellites flying across that part of the world, and it'll show the images and the tracking, and apparently it's shown that there's some Russian military hardware tanks trundling around in these two new mini countries. And he's saying it's serious. It's a sovereign state that has now had some of its land effectively annexed from it. I mean, see, he could have been the press secretary for old King George, couldn't he? Them rebels in America. What are they playing at? Let's get the Royal Navy and get the troops on it, get across to Georgetown and show them Americans who America really belongs to. Same nonsense. And people say, no, that was hundreds of years ago. Yeah, same difference. And he's saying we shouldn't hesitate to take whatever action we need to deter President Putin, as long as his kids didn't have to go and fight in any wars. Yeah, we all heard this before. Price of oil's up. You would expect that. Because a lot of people don't realise this, that Saudi Arabia is the biggest exporter, but it's Russia is the second biggest exporter. And a lot of people don't realise the say that, but it's the biggest exporter of gas. Gas by its very nature is harder to transport than oil, because oil is a liquid and gases are both fluids. But a barrel of oil, the energy capacity in that is far more than an equal volume of gas. Now, obviously, with gas, you can compress it and you can get more volume in your pipeline. But in essence, to be transported, it needs compressor stations and it needs gas pipelines to transport it. The other way is by LPG, but that's an expensive process. You've got to liquefy the gas, and then you've got to regas it at the other end. And you've got to have the infrastructure to take that. You've got to have the ships. You know, it's an expensive way. Pipelines is normally far better. We've got other people saying, we've got this guy here, Wood. He was a former UK ambassador to Russia. He's calling for a full package of measures to be imposed against Moscow immediately. Yeah, subito, straight away now. And he's wanting the Western people to target Russian banks and to bring an immediate end to plans to make the Nord Stream 2 operational. There you go again, Nord Stream 2. Ka-ching, 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 ka-ching. Get them fracking operations in the US going full pelt. Get that gas across to Germany. We've got a market for it. Look for the economics. Well, that's about it. Arrivederci.